My name is Calvin Hargrove, but most folks just call me Cal. I'm 41 years old, and I've been hauling freight for nearly 2 decades. You see a lot of things in this line of work. Bad weather, crazed drivers, and the occasional lonely stretch of road where the silence gets in your head. But nothing prepared me for what I encountered on Interstate 8 in the middle of the Sonoran Desert. I'll never forget that night. I don't think I could, even if I wanted to. I was hauling a load of luxury electronics out of Tucson, headed for San Diego. High-value cargo like this comes with tight deadlines, and with medical bills for my daughter piling up, I couldn't afford to miss a delivery. That's why I decided to take a shortcut through a lesser-traveled stretch of I-8. It was risky, sure. This part of Arizona doesn't have much in the way of gas stations or help if you get stranded, but I figured I could handle it. After all, I wasn't some rookie. The desert heat was oppressive during the day, and by the time the sun dipped below the horizon, the temperature plummeted. The road stretched endlessly before me, a thin ribbon of asphalt cutting through the barren wilderness. I settled into the rhythm of the drive, my rig's headlights carving out a tunnel of light in the darkness. It started as a faint sound on the wind, so soft I thought I'd imagined it. A melody, sweet and haunting, weaving its way through the hiss of the tires on the pavement. I turned down the radio, thinking maybe I'd picked up a strange frequency, but the music didn't stop. It seemed to come from outside, floating in the night air. I shook my head and laughed to myself. "You're just tired, Cal," I muttered. "Keep your eyes on the road." The laughter died in my throat when the GPS started glitching. The map screen flickered, then froze, the route recalculating over and over. The voice prompt stuttered, rerouting, turn back, rerouting. I smacked the device with my palm, but it was no use. The highway ahead looked empty, but I felt like I was being funneled somewhere. A few miles later, my suspicions deepened when I saw it. A wrecked car sitting crosswise on the road, its windows shattered. I slowed the rig to a crawl, scanning the area for signs of life. The car looked like it had been abandoned for days, maybe weeks. No skid marks, no debris. Just sitting there, daring me to approach. Something about the scene didn't sit right. My engine idled, the low rumble filling the cab as I debated what to do. Finally, I decided to ease around the wreck, taking the shoulder. As I inched past, my headlights caught something that made my blood run cold. Scrawled in black spray paint across the side of the car were the words, "No exit." I put my foot on the gas, desperate to put distance between me and that scene. The melody from earlier was back now, louder, though there was still no sign of its source. My pulse raced as I glanced in the rearview mirror. For a split second, I thought I saw movement, shadowy figures darting along the edges of the beam, but when I looked again, there was nothing there. The road narrowed, the desert on either side closing in. Tall saguaro cacti stood like sentinels in the dark, their spindly arms reaching skyward. A gust of wind kicked up, bringing with it a cloud of sand that reduced visibility to almost nothing. I slowed the rig and flicked on my hazards, squinting through the swirling dust. That's when I saw the lights. At first, I thought they were headlights, a pair of faint orbs hovering in the distance. But as I got closer, they didn't grow brighter or sharper. They just lingered, like they were watching me. I reached for the CB mic, hoping to hear from another driver, but all I got was static. "Anybody out there?" I called, my voice cracking. "This is Cal Hargrove, heading west on I-8. I've got some weird stuff happening." The static hissed back at me, and then, faintly, a voice whispered, "Turn back." I gripped the wheel tighter, my knuckles white. My rig was acting strange now, too. The engine temperature gauge was spiking, the needle bouncing erratically. The external camera system, which I relied on to check my blind spots, blinked out completely. I was flying blind, and whatever was out there wanted me to know it. As I rounded a bend, my headlights swept over something that made my stomach drop. A figure stood on the side of the road, illuminated for just a moment before disappearing into the dark. It was a woman, or at least it looked like one. She was barefoot, her hair billowing around her face as if caught in an unseen breeze. And she was singing. Her voice was the same melody I'd been hearing, sweet and mournful. I felt a strange pull, an urge to stop, to help her. But something deep in my gut told me not to. "Don't look back," I whispered to myself. "Don't stop." The temperature in the cab plummeted, my breath fogging up the windshield. I cranked the heater, but it made no difference. The singing grew louder, more insistent, filling my ears and drowning out the hum of the tires. I clutched the wheel, fighting the urge to pull over. The woman appeared again, this time directly in front of me. I slammed on the brakes, the rig skidding to a halt. She stood there, illuminated by my headlights, her face obscured by shadows. Slowly, she raised her hand and pointed, not at me, but past me. Against every instinct, I turned to look, and immediately regretted it. The rearview mirror showed figures, dozens of them, standing along the roadside. Their faces were blank, featureless, their bodies shimmering like heat mirages. They weren't solid, but they weren't entirely insubstantial either. And they were all watching me. I hit the gas, the engine roaring as the truck lurched forward. The figures vanished, but the woman remained, running alongside the rig. Her movements were impossible, her bare feet barely touching the ground as she kept pace. Her singing turned to laughter, a cold, mocking sound that sent chills down my spine. I reached for the glove box, my hand trembling. My dad had given me an old iron nail years ago, a good luck charm he said would ward off bad spirits. I'd always thought it was nonsense, but now I was willing to believe anything. I grabbed the nail and held it tight. The laughter stopped and the woman faltered, her form flickering like a faulty projector. I leaned out the window and thrust the nail toward her. She let out an ear-piercing shriek and disappeared into the night. The rig groaned as I pushed it harder than I should have, desperate to put as much distance as possible between me and whatever I'd just encountered. The GPS recalibrated, the route clearing up as if nothing had happened. By the time I reached El Centro, the first rays of dawn were breaking over the horizon. I pulled into a truck stop, my hands shaking as I killed the engine. The rig was covered in strange scorch marks, the paint blistered and peeling. I sat there for a long time staring at the horizon, trying to make sense of it all. Inside the diner, a fellow trucker saw me and raised an eyebrow. "Rough night?" he asked. "You could say that," I replied, my voice hoarse. "You didn't take the shortcut through the desert, did you?" I nodded slowly, and he let out a low whistle. "Bad move, friend. They say there's something out there, a siren or a spirit. It gets in your head, makes you see things, hear things. You're lucky you made it out." "Yeah," I said, fingering the nail in my pocket. "Lucky?" I never took that route again, and I never leave the nail behind. My name is Maggie Rourke, and I'm 38 years old. I've been trucking solo for the past 10 years, long enough to see just about everything the road can throw at you, or so I thought. What happened to me on Route 93 a few months back? That's something I'll never forget, no matter how many miles I put between me and that stretch of highway. I was hauling a load of industrial equipment out of Twin Falls, Idaho, headed for Phoenix, Arizona. Route 93 was my best option. Long, straight, and quiet, just the way I like it. I'd always preferred the isolation of desert highways, away from the noise and chaos of the city. But that route through Nevada, let's just say it earned its nickname, the Highway to Hell. The day started fine. The desert sun was brutal, as usual, and my rig's AC wasn't doing much to fight it. The CB chatter was light, just the occasional trucker complaining about fuel prices. By the time I rolled into Ely, the heat had left me drenched in sweat and itching to get off the road for a bit. I pulled into a tiny rundown gas station on the outskirts of town. The pumps looked older than me, and the place had a kind of eerie stillness to it. I went inside to grab a drink, and the attendant, a wiry guy with too many teeth, watched me like a hawk. When I brought my bottle of water to the counter, he leaned in too close. "You driving south?" he asked, his voice low. "Yeah," I said, not looking up. I didn't like the way he was staring. "Be careful out there. Things happen on this road." "Yeah? Like what?" I asked, half sarcastic, hoping to shut him up. "Just things." He didn't elaborate, and I didn't press. I paid for my water and left, the hairs on the back of my neck prickling. Back on the road, I couldn't shake the weird vibe from that gas station. The sun was setting, painting the desert in deep reds and purples, and the temperature was dropping fast. The highway stretched out endlessly in front of me, a ribbon of asphalt cutting through the barren landscape. That's when I saw him. He appeared out of nowhere. A man standing right in the middle of the road. I slammed on the brakes, my tires screeching as I fought to bring the rig to a stop. The man didn't flinch, didn't move an inch. He just stood there, staring at me. I grabbed my flashlight and climbed down from the cab, my boots crunching on the gravel shoulder. "Hey!" I called out. "You okay?" The man turned his head slowly, his movements stiff and unnatural. He was tall and thin, wearing a dusty black coat and a wide-brimmed hat that cast shadows over his face. Even in the dim light, something about him didn't sit right. His face was too pale, his eyes too dark. "My car broke down," he said, his voice flat and emotionless. "I need a ride." I hesitated. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to get back in the truck and drive, but the guy looked so helpless. Or maybe I was just tired and not thinking straight. Against my better judgment, I nodded. "Fine," I said. "Get in." He climbed into the passenger seat, moving with an odd, jerky gait, like a marionette on invisible strings. I couldn't help but notice how cold the air in the cab felt once he was inside. I turned the heater up a notch, trying to shake the sudden chill. "Where are you headed?" I asked, trying to make conversation. "South," he said simply, "same as you." Something about the way he said it sent a shiver down my spine. I glanced at him out of the corner of my eye. He was sitting perfectly still, his hands folded in his lap, staring straight ahead. The first hour passed in tense silence. The guy didn't say a word, and every time I tried to start a conversation, he shut it down with one-word answers. I started to regret picking him up, but I figured I'd drop him at the next town and be done with it. That's when the weird stuff started happening. It began with the radio. Static crackled over the speakers, cutting into my favorite country station. I fiddled with the dial, but no matter what frequency I turned to, all I got was that same low-pitched static. Then the headlights flickered. Just for a second, but long enough to make my stomach tighten. "Looks like your truck's acting up," the man said, his voice eerily calm. "It's fine," I said, though I didn't believe it. "She's just temperamental." The man didn't respond. He just smiled, this slow, creepy grin that didn't reach his eyes. That's when I noticed something in the side mirror. His reflection. It wasn't right. It moved slower than he did, like a lagging video feed. I blinked, thinking I must be imagining things, but when I looked again, it was still off. I tried to focus on the road, but the longer he sat there, the heavier the air in the cab felt. My hands were slick with sweat, and my heart was pounding in my chest. I decided I couldn't wait for the next town. I had to get this guy out of my truck. "We're coming up on a rest area," I lied. "You can get out there." "No need," he said, his tone icy. "I'm not going anywhere." I clenched the wheel tighter, my knuckles turning white. The truck started to feel like it was moving slower, like something was dragging it back. The gauges on the dashboard flickered, the needles dancing erratically. My GPS, which had been guiding me south, suddenly recalculated, directing me to make a U-turn. "What the hell?" I muttered, tapping the screen. "You're going the wrong way," the man said, his voice dripping with menace. "I know where I'm going," I snapped. "Do you?" he asked, leaning closer. His pale face was inches from mine, and for the first time I saw his eyes clearly, black as coal, with no whites at all. I slammed on the brakes, bringing the rig to a screeching halt. "Get out!" I shouted, my voice shaking. The man didn't move. "You invited me in, Maggie," he said, his grin widening. "You can't just tell me to leave." My stomach dropped. "How do you know my name?" "I know everything about you," he said, his voice low and guttural. "Your little trucking business that went belly up, your dad's iron nail still sitting in your glove box. I know why you drive alone, why you don't trust anyone, and I know you can't get rid of me." I grabbed the revolver I kept under the seat and aimed it at him. "Out now!" He laughed, a deep, inhuman sound that made my blood run cold. "That won't work," he said, "but if you want to try, go ahead." I fired. The bullet passed through him like smoke, shattering the passenger side window behind him. He didn't flinch. Instead, he leaned back and folded his arms, looking amused. Panic clawed at my chest, but then I remembered the nail. My dad had given it to me years ago, saying it was a good luck charm. I didn't believe in that kind of thing, but right now, I was willing to try anything. I popped open the glove box and grabbed the rusty nail. The man's grin faltered, his eyes narrowing. "You don't want to do that," he said, his voice losing some of its confidence. "Oh, I think I do," I said, gripping the nail tightly. I thrust it toward him, and he recoiled, letting out a guttural hiss. His form flickered, like a bad TV signal, and for a moment, I thought he might disappear. But he didn't. He lunged at me, his hands stretching into long, clawed fingers. I slammed the nail into his chest, and he let out a blood-curdling scream. His body convulsed, then exploded into a cloud of black smoke that filled the cab before vanishing through the broken window. I sat there, shaking, the nail still clutched in my hand. The truck's gauges stabilized, the headlights stopped flickering, and the GPS recalculated back to my original route. The air in the cab felt lighter, the oppressive weight lifted. I drove the rest of the way to Phoenix without stopping, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly they ached. I don't know what that thing was, a ghost, a demon, a hallucination brought on by too much caffeine and too little sleep. But I do know one thing. I'm never stopping for a hitchhiker again. And that rusty iron nail, it's not just a good luck charm anymore. It's my lifeline. My name is Jake Mitchell, and I'm 24 years old. This happened just a few months ago, on my first major run as a trucker. I was green, still learning the ropes, paired with a veteran mentor named Ray Givens. Ray's been driving rigs for 30 years, and he doesn't sugarcoat anything. "This ain't a job for fools, kid," he told me the first day. Turns out he was right, more than I could have ever imagined. It was late April, and we were hauling a load of lumber out of Denver. Headed west on Interstate 70, our destination was Salt Lake City, and the route would take us through the Eisenhower Tunnel and over Vail Pass. The weather report called for clear skies, but as anyone who's driven the Rockies knows, spring weather can turn mean in an instant. Ray didn't seem too worried about it. "Just stick close, kid," he said as we hit the highway. "Keep your ears open, your mouth shut, and always listen to the truck." The first leg of the trip was uneventful. We'd made good time by the time we reached the foothills, but as we climbed higher, the wind picked up, and the temperature dropped. By the time we approached the Eisenhower Tunnel, snow had started to fall, big wet flakes that clung to the windshield and froze as they slid down. "You ever chain up before?" Ray asked as he checked the mirrors. "Not in the wild," I admitted. "Pray, we don't have to," he said with a grunt, though something in his tone told me we might. We made it through the tunnel, but the storm worsened on the other side. The snow came down thick and fast, and the road disappeared under a sheet of white. Ray slowed us to a crawl, gripping the wheel with the steadiness of someone who'd been here 1,000 times before. "Keep your eyes peeled," he muttered, "and don't trust the GPS. It'll lead you straight into the ditch." That was when the CB radio crackled to life. "Breaker, breaker," a voice called, faint and tinny through the static. "Anybody out there? Stuck on the pass. Need help." Ray frowned and turned the volume knob. "Where you at, driver?" he asked. The response was garbled, barely audible over the hiss of the storm. "Jackknifed, near mile marker. Need help." "Sounds close," I said, craning my neck to look through the swirling snow. Ray shook his head. "Doesn't feel right. No way someone's out here without chains in this mess." "But what if they are?" I pressed. "What if they're in real trouble?" Ray shot me a look but didn't argue. "Fine, but we're not sticking around long. You see anything weird, you yell, got it?" We crept along until we spotted it, a jackknifed rig blocking most of the road. The cab doors were open, flapping in the wind, and snow was piling up inside. I grabbed a flashlight and climbed out, the icy wind cutting through my jacket like a knife. "Driver!" I called, shining the beam into the cab. "You here?" No response. The interior was a mess, papers scattered. A half-eaten sandwich frozen solid on the dashboard. But what caught my eye were the tracks in the snow. They led away from the truck, up the embankment, into the trees. "See anything?" Ray shouted from our cab. I hesitated, staring at the tracks. They were wrong. Too big to be human, with claw-like impressions that sent a chill down my spine. "Yeah," I called back. "Tracks, something's out here." Ray cursed under his breath. "Get back in the truck, now." I didn't argue. The second I slammed the door, Ray put the rig in gear and eased us past the wreck. "Don't ever get out like that again," he snapped, his voice tight with anger. "But what about the driver?" I asked. "What if—" "There's no driver," he cut me off. "Not anymore." His words hung heavy in the air, and I didn't press further. As we climbed higher, the storm grew fiercer. The heater in the cab sputtered and died, leaving us shivering in our seats. To make matters worse, the air brake warning light flickered on the dash. "Great," Ray muttered. "Brakes are freezing up. We'll have to pull over and fix it." We found a wide shoulder and stopped. Ray grabbed his tools, and I followed him out into the biting cold. "Chain up while you're at it," he ordered. "We'll need 'em on the descent." I fumbled with the heavy chains, my fingers numb and clumsy. That's when I heard it. A low, guttural growl, carried on the wind. I froze, my breath fogging in front of me. "Ray," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "What?" he barked without looking up. "There's something out there." Ray straightened, his flashlight sweeping across the snow. For a moment, I thought I'd imagined it. Then I saw them. 2 glowing eyes reflecting the beam from the trees. Ray didn't hesitate. He grabbed me by the arm and hauled me back to the truck. "Move!" he barked. We barely made it inside before something slammed into the side of the cab, hard enough to rock the whole rig. I caught a glimpse of it through the window. A gaunt, humanoid figure with elongated limbs and a twisted, skeletal face. It let out a piercing screech and vanished into the storm. "What the hell was that?" I gasped. Ray didn't answer. He jammed the truck into gear and floored it, the tires spinning before they caught traction. The next hour was a blur of white-knuckle driving and frantic prayers. The creature wasn't gone. It was following us, darting in and out of the snow, slamming into the trailer, trying to force us off the road. At one point, the passenger side mirror shattered, showering me with glass. Blood trickled down my cheek, but I barely noticed. All I could think about was the thing outside, its glowing eyes, its twisted grin. "We can't outrun it," I said, panic rising in my throat. Ray nodded grimly. "We're not trying to. We're gonna fight back." He reached under the seat and pulled out a flare gun. "Take the wheel," he ordered. "What?" "Take the damn wheel." I slid over, my hands shaking as I gripped the controls. Ray rolled down his window and leaned out, taking aim. The flare shot through the night like a comet, striking the creature square in the chest. It let out a bone-chilling scream and disappeared into the trees. "Did we get it?" I asked, my voice trembling. "Not for long," Ray said, slamming the window shut. "We need to end this now." We reached a narrow switchback and stopped. Ray grabbed a can of diesel from the storage compartment and doused the load of lumber in the trailer. "Light it up," he said, handing me the flare gun. "Are you serious?" "Do it!" I hesitated for a moment, then fired. The flames roared to life, illuminating the storm in an eerie orange glow. The creature appeared again, its twisted body silhouetted against the fire. It hesitated, then let out a guttural hiss and disappeared into the night. The fire burned for hours, and we stayed in the cab, watching and waiting. When dawn finally broke, the storm had passed, and the creature was nowhere to be seen. Ray didn't say much as we descended the mountain, his face a mask of exhaustion. My arm throbbed where the creature had scratched me, and the wound looked worse, discolored and swollen. "Hospital," Ray said when he noticed. "First thing." I nodded, too tired to argue. They patched me up at the ER, but the doctors couldn't explain the wound. They said it didn't look like anything they'd seen before. Ray and I parted ways after that trip. He told me to keep driving, but to always trust my instincts and never stop on the pass again. I haven't been back to Vale since, but sometimes, late at night, I hear that guttural growl in my dreams, and I wonder if it's still out there waiting. My name is Tom Reeves, and I was 42 when it happened. I've been trucking for nearly 20 years, and in all that time I never believed in ghost stories. Not Bigfoot, not aliens, none of that nonsense. But after that night on Donner Pass, I don't know what to believe anymore. It was late February, and I had a haul to make, a refrigerated load of produce heading from Reno to Sacramento. The weather had been decent when I started, but Donner Pass is unpredictable, and by the time I hit the summit, a snowstorm had rolled in like a white curtain. The snow was falling thick and fast, the kind that eats up your headlights and makes it impossible to see more than a few feet in front of you. I thought about pulling over, but the load was time-sensitive and I've driven through worse. Or so I told myself. The first sign that something was off came about 30 miles in. The snow had started to stick, and the wind was howling like a banshee, making the truck shudder with every gust. I was crawling along at 20 miles per hour, trying to keep the rig steady, when I saw something in the road. At first, I thought it was a deer. It was small, pale, and crouched low to the ground. But as I got closer, I realized it wasn't an animal. It was a kid. A little boy, maybe 6 or 7 years old, wearing what looked like an old-fashioned white shirt and pants. His skin was pale as the snow, and his dark hair was plastered to his head like he'd been out there for hours. He stood perfectly still in the middle of the road, staring at me. I slammed on the brakes, my heart pounding. The truck skidded on the ice, the trailer jackknifing slightly before coming to a stop. When I looked up again, the boy was gone. I sat there for a moment, my hands gripping the wheel so tight my knuckles ached. My first thought was that I'd imagined it. The snow, the stress, it could mess with your head. But then I noticed something. On the windshield, right where the boy had been standing, there was a smudge. A small handprint pressed into the glass. "Hell no," I muttered. I grabbed my flashlight, threw on my jacket, and stepped out into the storm. The wind cut through me like a knife, but I didn't care. I needed to know if I'd really seen what I thought I saw. The snow was falling so fast that my tracks were already filling in, but there were no other footprints. Nothing. Just the empty road stretching into the white void. I climbed back into the cab, shaking more from nerves than cold. I wiped the handprint off the windshield and told myself it was just frost. Just some weird trick of the light. But deep down, I didn't believe that. The snow kept piling up, and before long, it was clear I wasn't going anywhere. I pulled over to a small turnout, set the brakes, and killed the engine. The wind howled around the truck, and the snow piled up against the doors, making it feel like I was being buried alive. I switched on the bunk heater and settled in for what I hoped would be a quiet night. It wasn't. Around midnight, I woke up to a sound. Tap, tap, tap. At first, I thought it was just the wind rattling the cab. But then I heard it again, louder this time. Tap, tap, tap. It was coming from the passenger side window. I grabbed my flashlight and pointed it at the window. For a second, I thought I saw something. A pale face pressed against the glass, its eyes wide and unblinking. But when I blinked, it was gone. "Okay, Tom," I said out loud, trying to steady my nerves. "You're just tired. Your mind's playing tricks on you." But then I heard it again. Tap, tap, tap. This time, it was coming from the back of the truck. I climbed into the driver's seat and flicked on the rear lights. The snow was so thick that I could barely see the trailer, but I caught a glimpse of movement. A shadow darting behind the rig. "Who's out there?" I shouted, my voice cracking. I grabbed the tire iron I kept under the seat and stepped out into the storm, my flashlight cutting a narrow beam through the darkness. I circled the truck, my boots crunching through the snow. The wind howled, carrying with it a faint sound that made my blood run cold. It was a child's laughter, soft and high-pitched, like it was coming from everywhere and nowhere all at once. I swung the flashlight wildly, my heart hammering in my chest. "Who's there?" I yelled. No answer, just the wind. I climbed back into the truck and locked the doors, my hands trembling. I wanted to believe it was just some kid messing around, but deep down, I knew better. There was no way anyone could survive out there in this weather, let alone a child. I tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, I heard that laughter. It echoed in my head, growing louder and more insistent until I thought I would lose my mind. When I finally opened my eyes, I saw him again. The boy. He was standing outside the windshield, his face pale and gaunt, his dark eyes boring into mine. He raised a hand and pressed it against the glass, leaving another perfect handprint. Then he opened his mouth, and though I couldn't hear his words, I knew what he was saying. "Help me." The storm finally started to die down around dawn. The snow lightened and the wind fell silent, leaving the world eerily still. I didn't waste any time. I fired up the engine, grateful that it started without issue, and got the hell out of there. As I drove, I kept glancing in the mirrors, half expecting to see the boy again. But the road behind me was empty, just a long stretch of snow-covered asphalt. When I reached Sacramento, I pulled into the yard and parked the rig. My dispatcher came out to meet me, frowning as he looked at the truck. "What the hell happened to your windshield?" he asked. I followed his gaze and my stomach dropped. The handprint was still there, frozen into the glass like a brand. No matter how much I scrubbed, it wouldn't come off. I haven't driven Donner Pass since that night. I tell myself it was just my imagination, that the storm and the isolation messed with my head. But every time I see a snowstorm on the news or hear a child's laugh in the distance, I think about that boy. And I think about what might have happened if I'd opened the door. And I pray I never find out. My name is Cassie Blackwell, and I was 36 years old when it happened. It was late October, just after midnight, and I was hauling auto parts from Salt Lake City to Reno. I'd been on the road for years, and I thought I'd seen it all. Snowstorms in Wyoming, wildfires in California, and a few shady characters at rest stops. But nothing had prepared me for what I encountered on Interstate 80 that night. I was cruising through the Utah desert, nothing but endless black stretching out in every direction. The highway was deserted, the kind of lonely that makes you feel like you're the only person left on Earth. My radio was busted, and my phone had no signal. Typical out here. It was just me, the hum of the engine, and the steady thrum of tires on asphalt. That's when I saw her. She was standing on the shoulder, a slim figure illuminated by my high beams. She wore a long, tattered coat, and her dark hair hung limp around her face. One arm was raised in a half-hearted hitchhiking gesture. My first instinct was to keep driving. You don't pick up hitchhikers, not in this line of work, not at this time of night. But something about her stopped me. Maybe it was the way she looked, lost and desperate. Or maybe I just didn't want to feel the weight of guilt if I read about her disappearance in the news later. I slowed to a stop and rolled down the passenger window. "Where you headed?" I called. She didn't answer at first, just stared at me with wide, glassy eyes. Finally, she said west. Her voice was soft, barely audible over the rumble of the engine. Against my better judgment, I unlocked the door. "Hop in." She climbed in without a word, clutching a small backpack to her chest. As we pulled back onto the highway, I tried to make conversation. "Name's Cassie," I said. "What about you?" She hesitated. "Emma." "Where are you coming from?" "Nowhere," she said quietly. "It doesn't matter." Okay, I thought, not exactly the chatty type. Still, there was something off about her. She was pale, almost unnaturally so, and her hands shook as she clutched the backpack. I figured she might be running from something, or someone. Not my business, I told myself. We drove in silence for a while. Then the weird stuff started happening. First, the headlights flickered. Just for a second, but enough to catch my attention. Then the CB radio crackled to life, even though it hadn't worked all night. A man's voice came through, faint and distorted, like a bad signal. "Cassie, don't stop, keep going." My heart skipped. I glanced at the radio, but the static had already swallowed the voice. Emma shifted in her seat. "Everything okay?" she asked, her tone casual. Too casual. "Yeah," I said. "Radio's just acting up." She didn't respond, but I caught her staring at me out of the corner of my eye. Her gaze was heavy, unnerving. I gripped the wheel tighter. About 20 miles down the road, things got worse. A figure appeared in the middle of the highway, standing motionless with its arms at its sides. It was a man, or at least it looked like one. He wore a suit, though it was dirty and torn, and his head was tilted at an unnatural angle. "Do you see that?" I asked, my voice shaking. Emma didn't answer. I swerved to avoid the figure, but when I looked in the rearview mirror, there was no one there. My pulse thundered in my ears. I glanced at Emma, but she was staring straight ahead, her expression blank. "What the hell is going on?" I muttered. The tension in the cab was suffocating. Emma started humming softly, a tune I didn't recognize but found deeply unsettling. Her voice was low and monotone like a broken music box. I tried to ignore it, focusing on the road, but the sound crawled under my skin. "Do you believe in fate?" she asked suddenly. Her question caught me off guard. "What?" "Fate," she repeated. "Do you think some people are meant to be on certain paths?" "I don't know," I said, my voice tight. "I don't really think about that kind of thing." She smiled, a strange knowing smile that sent a chill down my spine. "Maybe you should." The truck started to shudder, the engine coughing like it was struggling to breathe. Then it died completely, leaving us coasting in silence. I pulled to the shoulder and tried to restart it, but the ignition clicked uselessly. "Damn it," I muttered, "just my luck." Emma didn't say anything. She just stared at me with that same eerie smile. "You okay?" I asked, my frustration giving way to unease. "I'm fine," she said. "But you're not." Her words sent a jolt of fear through me. What's that supposed to mean? She leaned closer, her face inches from mine. Her eyes, once glassy, were now pitch black, like twin voids. "You should have kept driving." I scrambled out of the cab, my heart racing. The desert was silent. The kind of silence that felt alive, pressing in on me from all sides. When I turned back to the truck, Emma was gone. The passenger seat was empty, her backpack lying open on the floor. Inside were photos of me. Dozens of them, taken from angles that made no sense. Some were from inside my truck. Others were from places I hadn't been in years. Panic surged through me. I grabbed my flashlight and scanned the darkness, but there was no sign of her. Just the empty highway stretching into nothingness. Then I heard it. A soft, lilting hum. The same tune Emma had been humming in the truck. It was coming from behind me. I turned, and there she was, standing in the middle of the road, her face twisted into something inhuman. Her mouth stretched too wide, her teeth jagged and sharp. "You should have kept driving," she repeated, her voice layered with something deep and guttural. I didn't wait to find out what she meant. I bolted for the truck, slamming the door shut and locking it behind me. The engine roared to life on the first try, and I floored it, the tires squealing as I tore down the highway. In the rearview mirror, Emma stood motionless, her black eyes watching me until she faded into the distance. But her humming stayed with me, echoing in my ears long after I was miles away. I made it to Elko by dawn, but I didn't sleep for days. I never told anyone what happened. Not the cops, not the company, not even my friends. Who would believe me? All I know is this: I'll never stop for another hitchhiker. Not on I-80, not anywhere. Some people, or things, don't belong on the road. And sometimes it's best to just keep driving. My name is Danny Mendoza, and I was 24 years old when this happened. It was my first long-haul night drive, and I'll never forget it. Not because of the cargo or the route, but because of what followed us down that godforsaken stretch of road. This was back in late summer, 2 years ago, when I was a rookie driver riding with Charlie Yazzie, a seasoned trucker and my mentor. It started as a regular run. We were hauling construction supplies from Farmington to Gallup, New Mexico. Charlie had been driving this route for years, though he didn't like it much. Locals called it the Highway of the Devil, Route 491. I laughed when I first heard that. The road looked harmless enough, just endless miles of empty desert, red cliffs, and occasional gas stations that seemed frozen in time. "Don't laugh," Charlie said, his deep voice calm but firm as always. "This road has history. People disappear here, sometimes worse." I thought he was pulling my leg, trying to spook the rookie, so I shrugged it off. That was mistake number one. The night started to turn strange about 30 miles outside of Farmington. I was at the wheel, and Charlie was leaned back in the passenger seat, his ball cap pulled low over his face. The CB radio crackled to life with static, followed by a voice so faint I could barely hear it. "Help! Someone! Please!" "Charlie, you hear that?" I asked, turning the volume knob. "Hear what?" "The radio," I said. It sounded like someone calling for help. Charlie sat up and squinted at the CB. "It's just interference. Happens a lot out here. This stretch of highway is like a magnet for weird signals." I nodded, trying to push down the unease creeping up my spine. The voice had sounded too clear to be static. Not long after, I saw something, or thought I did. At the edge of the headlights, just off the road, a figure stood motionless. It was tall and thin, wearing what looked like torn clothes. Something shiny glinted in its hand like a piece of broken glass. "Charlie," I said, my voice tighter than I wanted it to be. "You see that?" "See what?" He looked up and peered through the windshield. By then, the figure was gone. There was someone standing out there. "Probably just a shadow from the cliffs," Charlie said. "Or your eyes playing tricks. This place does that to people." I wasn't convinced, but I didn't argue. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that the figure had been staring right at me. The next couple of hours passed quietly, but the unease lingered. The CB acted up again, emitting bursts of static that made my skin crawl. Then the GPS went dark. I tapped the screen, but it refused to load. Charlie sighed. "Guess we're doing this old school. Stay on this route and don't stop for anything. Got it?" "Got it," I said, though I felt my nerves fraying. Not long after that, the storm hit. A wall of sand rose up out of nowhere, swallowing the headlights and turning the world into a swirling red blur. The wind howled like a living thing, rattling the truck. "Slow it down, but keep moving," Charlie instructed. "Storms like this pass quick, but you don't want to get stuck in one." I eased off the accelerator, gripping the wheel so tight my knuckles turned white. The sandstorm howled, but underneath the noise, I thought I heard something else. Something like footsteps tapping along the outside of the truck. We made it through the storm, but the night didn't get any easier. As the dust settled, Charlie pointed out something on the road ahead. A pattern of rocks and sticks lay scattered across the asphalt, arranged in strange, deliberate shapes. "Don't touch them," Charlie said sharply, as if I'd been planning to jump out and rearrange them. "What are they?" I asked. "Curses," he said, "or warnings. Either way, you don't mess with them." I laughed nervously, but Charlie's expression stayed grim. He leaned forward, muttering something under his breath. A prayer, I realized. That was the first time I saw real fear in his eyes, and it made my stomach twist. Then the lights appeared. 2 bright beams flared up in the rearview mirror, growing larger as a vehicle approached. At first, I thought it was just another truck, but something felt off. The lights followed us too closely, speeding up when we did and slowing down when we did. "They've been back there a while," I said, trying to sound casual. "Yeah," Charlie said, his voice flat. "Don't worry about it." But I did worry. I watched those lights like a hawk, waiting for them to pass or turn off. They didn't. They just hung there, too close, like they were watching us. When we pulled into a lonely gas station, the lights vanished. I scanned the empty lot, my nerves on edge, but there were no other vehicles in sight. The gas station itself was a relic from another era. with a flickering neon sign and an old man behind the counter who barely looked up as we walked in. As I grabbed a couple of sodas, Charlie leaned in close. "Keep an eye on the truck," he said quietly. "Don't let anyone near it." "Why? You think someone's out there?" "Just do it," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Sure enough, as we walked back to the truck, two men emerged from the shadows. One was skinny and jittery, the other big and mean-looking. "Truckers, huh?" the big one said. "You headed south?" "Not your business," Charlie said, stepping between me and the men. The skinny one circled around, eyeing the truck. "Nice rig. What you hauling?" "Nothing for you," Charlie snapped. The big guy smirked and reached into his pocket, but Charlie didn't wait to find out what he was reaching for. He pulled a crowbar from the side of the truck and swung it in a wide arc, forcing the men to back off. "Get lost," Charlie growled. "Now!" They ran off, cursing under their breath. My heart was pounding as we climbed back into the cab. "Cartel?" I asked. "Probably," Charlie said, "or just local thieves. Either way, they were after the cargo." The rest of the night was a blur of tension. The strange lights returned, tailing us again, and the figure I'd seen earlier appeared once more, this time in the middle of the road. It was closer now, its features clearer. Its face was pale and hollow, its eyes black pits, and its limbs moved with an unnatural, jerky motion. I slammed on the brakes, skidding to a stop just in time to avoid hitting it. But when I looked again, it was gone. "Drive," Charlie said, his voice trembling. "Don't stop. Don't look back." I didn't argue. My hands shook as I gripped the wheel, my foot pressing the pedal harder than it should have. The lights behind us grew brighter, closing the distance, and the figure appeared again, this time running alongside the truck. Its speed was impossible, its movements inhuman. When it slammed its hand against the window, the glass cracked and I screamed. We finally hit the outskirts of Gallup just before dawn. The city lights were the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen. The pursuing vehicle disappeared as we reached civilization. But the scratches on the truck and the crack in the windshield were proof of what we'd been through. As we unloaded the cargo, I asked Charlie what he thought it all meant. "Sometimes the line between the living and the dead gets thin," he said. "And sometimes people use that fear to get what they want. Could have been spirits. Could have been people. Maybe both." I didn't know what to say. Even now, I'm not sure what I believe. All I know is that I've never driven Route 491 again, and I don't plan to. Some roads are better left alone. My name is Tanya Perkins, and I'm 34 years old. I've been driving big rigs for nearly a decade, ever since I left my small-town life behind. I loved the freedom of the open road, the solitude, the control. But this story isn't about freedom. It's about the time I drove through the Rockies on I-70 and came face to face with something I still can't explain. This happened last winter. I was hauling a load of high-end electronics from Denver to Grand Junction. A tight schedule and a fat bonus for early delivery had me pushing harder than I should have. The storm wasn't supposed to hit until morning, but weather in the Rockies doesn't follow anyone's schedule, and the first flakes started falling as I pulled out of Denver. The climb into the mountains was slow, the snow coming down harder with every mile. I had my chains on, my headlights cutting through the whiteout, but visibility was lousy. My usual road playlist, classic rock mostly, felt too cheerful for the weather, so I switched to silence, just me and the hum of the engine. About 2 hours in, I passed a wreck. Tire tracks led off the road near a curve, disappearing into a ravine. I slowed to look, but all I could see was the bent guardrail and the abyss beyond. No emergency vehicles, no lights, just darkness. Something about it gnawed at me, but I had a deadline to meet, so I pushed on. The first sign of trouble came over the CB radio. Static crackled to life, and then a voice, faint and distant. "You'll need to stop soon." I grabbed the mic. "This is Tanya Perkins. Who's out there? Do you need help?" No answer. Just static. I shook my head and kept driving, chalking it up to bad reception. An hour later, as the storm intensified, I saw him. A figure on the side of the road, waving one arm, the other clutching a backpack. My first thought was that he was stranded, and my gut said to keep driving. Highway Safety 101 is never to pick up hitchhikers. But something about the storm, the isolation, and the way he stood there made me pull over. He climbed into the passenger seat, shaking snow off his coat. He was young, mid-20s maybe, with messy blonde hair and a thin frame. His face was pale, but his eyes were sharp and blue. "Thanks," he said, his voice steady. "Didn't think anyone would stop." "No problem," I said, though my instincts were screaming at me that this was a problem. "Where are you headed?" "Doesn't matter, just somewhere warm." I nodded, easing back onto the road. He stared out the window, silent for a while. I focused on the white lines, my knuckles tight on the wheel. "What's your name?" I asked finally, more to break the silence than anything. "Eli," he said. "What about you?" "Tanya." He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Nice to meet you, Tanya." As the miles ticked by, Eli started talking. At first, it was normal stuff. How bad the storm was, how dangerous the pass could be. But then he started mentioning things he shouldn't have known. "You ever hear about the wreck up here?" he asked, gesturing vaguely at the windshield. "Which one?" I said. "Plenty of them happen on this road." "This one was years ago," he said, his voice low. "A trucker slid off during a storm, right near that curve back there. They say he didn't see the ice until it was too late." My chest tightened. I knew exactly the wreck he was talking about. It was my father's. He'd died on this very road when I was 15. "How do you know that?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Eli just smiled. I wanted to stop the truck, kick him out, but the storm had turned into a full whiteout. The road was barely visible, and my GPS had gone haywire, the screen flashing and rebooting. "It gets worse up ahead," Eli said, as if reading my thoughts. "The ice, I mean. Real slick around the next curve." "Thanks for the tip," I said, through clenched teeth. The thing is, he was right. As I rounded the bend, the rig skidded, tires fighting for grip on the black ice. I managed to keep it steady, my heart pounding, but I couldn't shake the feeling that Eli knew more than he was letting on. A few miles later, we ran into another problem. 3 SUVs were blocking the road, their headlights blinding in the storm. A group of men climbed out, faces shadowed by hoods, and started toward the truck. "Thieves," Eli said, his voice calm. "What do they want?" I whispered, though I already knew the answer. My cargo was worth a fortune, and they were here to take it. I locked the doors and reached for my phone, but there was no signal. The men were shouting now, pounding on the cab with their fists. "They won't make it far," Eli said. "What are you talking about?" I snapped. Before he could answer, a deafening roar filled the air. I looked up just in time to see a rock slide crashing down the mountainside, burying the SUVs and the men beneath tons of snow and stone. Eli turned to me, his expression unreadable. "Told you." By now, I was shaking. "Who the hell are you?" I demanded, my voice cracking. Eli leaned back in his seat, his eyes fixed on mine. "You already know." I didn't respond. I couldn't. "The road has rules," he continued. "Some people follow them. Some don't. Your dad didn't." "Don't talk about my dad," I snapped. gripping the wheel so hard my knuckles ached. "He's why you're here," Eli said. "He's why I'm here." I slammed on the brakes, the rig skidding to a stop. The storm howled around us, snow swirling in the headlights. "Get out," I said, my voice trembling. Eli just smiled. "You're almost there, Tanya. Just keep driving." When I turned to look at him again, he was gone. The passenger seat was empty, the door still locked. I sat there for a long moment, trying to catch my breath before finally putting the truck in gear. The rest of the drive was a blur. The storm began to ease as I descended the mountain, the road becoming clearer with each passing mile. When I reached the distribution center in Grand Junction, I climbed out of the cab, exhausted but alive. The manager was waiting, clipboard in hand, but I barely heard his words. My mind was stuck on Eli, on his cryptic warnings, on the wreck he shouldn't have known about. Before I climbed back into the cab, I noticed something on the passenger side window. A patch of frost, shaped like a handprint. I don't know who or what Eli was. Maybe he was a ghost. Maybe he was something else entirely. All I know is that I'll never forget his words. The road has rules, and now I never break them. My name is Cole Turner. I'm 48 years old, and I've spent more than half my life behind the wheel of a big rig. I've seen just about everything the road has to offer. Blinding snowstorms, mechanical breakdowns in the middle of nowhere, and the kind of strange, inexplicable things you don't talk about if you want to keep your job. But nothing, and I mean nothing, could have prepared me for what happened last winter on Donner Pass. This all started on a Tuesday night. I was hauling a load of perishable food, frozen vegetables and meat, out of Sacramento, heading east to Reno. The route was familiar enough, but Donner Pass has a reputation. People who've driven it will tell you about the steep grades, the sudden storms, and the history. Everyone knows about the Donner Party, the pioneers who got stranded up there in the 1840s and turned to, well, desperate measures. But for me, Donner was just another mountain pass, or at least that's what I thought. The first few hours of the drive were uneventful. The sky was clear, the air crisp, and the radio was playing old Johnny Cash tunes, my go-to for long hauls. I made good time getting out of Sacramento and started the climb into the Sierra Nevada. The dispatcher had warned me about an incoming storm, but I figured I'd beat it if I kept a steady pace. It was just past 10 p.m. when the first snowflakes started falling. They were light at first, swirling lazily in my headlights. By the time I hit the higher elevations, it was coming down hard, and the road was getting slick. I slowed the rig to a crawl, muttering to myself about how the weather always seemed to go sideways at the worst times. Then, the first strange thing happened. My CB radio crackled to life, which wasn't unusual, except the channel was dead quiet. No trucker chatter, no weather updates, just static. I reached for the knob to turn it off when a voice cut through the noise. "You can't leave." I froze. The voice was faint, barely audible, but clear enough to make out the words. It sounded like a woman's voice, shaky and strained, like she was cold and scared. I grabbed the mic and pressed the button. "Who's out there? Do you need help?" No response, just static. I shook my head, chalking it up to interference from the storm. But something about that voice stuck with me. It wasn't just the words, it was the way she said them, like she was talking directly to me. The storm grew worse. The snow was coming down in thick sheets now, and the wind howled like it had a grudge. I was inching along, chains on my tires, when I saw her. A figure on the side of the road, standing perfectly still in the snow. At first, I thought it was another driver who'd broken down or someone hitchhiking, though what they'd be doing up here in this weather was beyond me. As I got closer, I realized something was off. She wasn't dressed for the cold, just a torn, old-fashioned dress that clung to her like a second skin. Her hair was wet, hanging in dark strands over her face. I slowed the truck, debating whether to stop. That's when she lifted her head, and I saw her face, or rather, what should have been her face. There was nothing there. No eyes, no nose, no mouth. Just smooth, pale skin, stretched tight over bone. I hit the gas, my heart hammering in my chest. The rig groaned as it climbed the hill, the headlights cutting through the blizzard. I glanced in my side mirror and saw her again, standing by the road as if I hadn't just passed her. By the time I reached the summit, I was shaking. I told myself it was just the storm messing with my head. Fatigue and bad weather play tricks on the mind, right? But deep down, I knew that wasn't it. The CB crackled again, and this time the woman's voice was clearer. "You can't leave," she repeated. "We never left." "Who the hell are you?" I snapped, gripping the mic. "What do you want?" Silence. Then, faintly, a sound that sent chills down my spine. A low, mournful wail, like someone crying in the distance. Not long after that, the rig started acting up. First, the dashboard lights flickered, then the engine sputtered. Finally, the refrigeration unit in the trailer shut off completely. I pulled over to the side of the road, the tires crunching in the snow, and climbed out to check the trailer. The wind was like knives against my face as I trudged to the back of the rig. When I opened the trailer doors, the cold inside hit me like a wall. It was colder than it should have been, colder than the air outside. My breath hung in the air, and I could see frost forming on the walls. But the weirdest part? There were handprints on the frosted metal, dozens of them, like someone or something had been inside. I slammed the doors shut and hurried back to the cab. As I climbed in, I caught a glimpse of her in my rearview mirror. She was sitting in the passenger seat, her hollow eyes staring straight ahead. I didn't scream, I couldn't. My throat closed up and all I could do was grip the steering wheel and pray. When I finally worked up the courage to look again, she was gone. I tried to start the truck, but the engine wouldn't turn over. The wind howled louder, shaking the rig, and I swore I could hear voices in it. Whispers, faint and fleeting, like a crowd murmuring just out of earshot. I thought about getting out again, but something told me I wouldn't make it back if I did. Instead, I reached into the glove compartment and pulled out the pouch of sage I always kept there. My grandmother had given it to me years ago, telling me it would keep me safe on the road. At the time, I thought it was just a sweet gesture, but now I wasn't so sure. I lit the sage with my lighter, letting the smoke fill the cab, and muttered a prayer under my breath. Almost immediately, the whispers stopped. The wind died down, and the truck's engine roared to life. I didn't waste any time getting out of there. The rig rumbled down the pass, the chains on the tires biting into the icy road. But even as I drove, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Every so often, I'd catch a glimpse of her in the mirror or see a shadow dart across the road. The last time I saw her was just before I reached Reno. She was standing on the shoulder of the highway, watching me with those hollow eyes. This time, she raised a hand, as if to wave, or maybe to warn. I made it to the distribution center with the cargo intact, though I was hours late. The dispatcher chewed me out, but I didn't care. All I could think about was getting the hell out of there and as far from Donner Pass as possible. As I climbed out of the cab, I noticed something on the windshield, a patch of frost in the shape of a face. Her face. I don't drive Donner Pass anymore. I don't even like talking about it. But sometimes, late at night when the roads are quiet and the radio's playing nothing but static, I think about her, about what she said. You can't leave. And I wonder if she was right. My name is Joe Yazzie, and I'm 43 years old. I've been trucking for over 20 years, most of it on the back roads and highways of the Southwest. What happened on US 491 wasn't my first strange encounter on the road, but it's the one that stayed with me, the one that nearly cost me everything. This was last summer, during a haul from Farmington, New Mexico to a mining site out in Arizona. I was driving with my partner, Ray Andrews, who was just a couple of years into the job. She was sharp, fearless, and skeptical of anything she couldn't explain. Qualities I respected but sometimes worried might get her in trouble. It was late afternoon when we started the drive. The sun was sinking low, casting long shadows over the mesas and canyons that stretch endlessly along the Devil's Highway. Ray was in the passenger seat, feet propped up on the dashboard, flipping through her phone. "Ever wonder why they call this stretch the Devil's Highway?" she asked, scrolling through some article. "I mean, besides the whole 666 thing from back when." I glanced at her, my hands steady on the wheel. It's not just the name. A lot of bad things have happened out here. Wrecks, disappearances. Some people think the land's cursed. She smirked. "Cursed, huh? Let me guess, skinwalkers?" I didn't answer right away. The Navajo don't talk about skinwalkers lightly, and I didn't like her making a joke of it. "You don't have to believe it," I said finally, "but respect it." Ray rolled her eyes and went back to her phone. I let the silence settle between us as the miles ticked by. By the time we hit the stretch near Shiprock, the sky had turned a bruised purple. That's when the first sign of trouble started. Our headlights began flickering. Ray frowned. "Is that normal?" "No," I said, flipping the switch a couple of times. The lights stayed steady for a moment, then flickered again. "Might be a short in the wiring. I'll check it at the next stop." A few minutes later, the CB crackled to life. At first, it was just static, but then a voice came through, faint and distorted. "Joe, it's not safe out here." I stiffened, my grip tightening on the wheel. Ray sat up straighter, staring at the radio. "What the hell was that?" The voice came again, clearer this time. "Joe, you have to leave." My heart pounded in my chest. The voice was familiar, too familiar. It sounded like my brother, David. But David's been dead for 15 years, lost to a crash on this very highway. Ray reached for the radio. "Who is this?" The CB went dead. I didn't say anything, just kept driving. Ray looked at me, her face pale. "You okay, Joe?" "Yeah," I lied. "Probably just some idiot messing with the channel." The storm hit an hour later. It came out of nowhere, a wall of sand and wind that reduced visibility to nothing. I slowed the rig to a crawl, the wipers working overtime to keep the windshield clear. "This is insane," Ray muttered, squinting into the swirling dust. "We're gonna be late." "Better late than dead," I said, keeping my focus on the faint glow of the taillights ahead. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the storm broke. The road ahead was clear, the air still. But something felt off. The usual hum of the truck, the sound of tires on asphalt. It was all too quiet. "Do you hear that?" I asked. "Hear what?" "Exactly." We passed an old cluster of trailers on the side of the road, abandoned and rusted out. As we rolled by, I thought I saw movement. A shadow slipping between the trailers. I told myself it was just my imagination, but the feeling of being watched stayed with me. A few miles later, Ray spoke up. "There's someone on the side of the road." I looked where she was pointing and saw them. A figure standing motionless by the guardrail. As we got closer, I realized something was wrong. The figure wasn't moving, wasn't reacting to our headlights, and their face, there was no face, just a smooth, featureless surface. Ray let out a nervous laugh. Okay, that's creepy as hell." I didn't respond. My gut told me to keep driving, to not even slow down. Things got worse after that. The GPS started acting up, giving us directions that made no sense. Turn here, make a U-turn, take a dirt road that didn't exist. Then the rig stalled, the engine cutting out without warning. I pulled to the side of the road and tried the ignition. Nothing. "Stay here," I told Ray, grabbing a flashlight. I climbed out of the cab and popped the hood. Everything looked fine, but the truck wouldn't start. I was about to climb back in when I heard it, a low, guttural growl coming from the darkness. "Joe?" Ray called from the cab. "What's going on?" I shone the flashlight around but didn't see anything. Still, the feeling of being watched was stronger than ever. I got back in the truck and locked the doors. "We'll wait it out," I said. "See if it starts up again in a bit." That's when the SUV showed up. Its headlights appeared in the side mirror, pulling up behind us. 2 more vehicles followed, boxing us in. Ray tensed beside me. "What do they want?" "Trouble," I said. The men got out of their vehicles, armed with crowbars and bats. They started toward the rig, shouting for us to open up. One of them climbed onto the trailer, trying to get into the cargo bay. "Call for help," I told Ray, but she shook her head. "No signal." The men were banging on the doors now, trying to break in. I reached under my seat and grabbed the tire iron I kept there. "Stay here." "Joe, don't..." But before I could step out, something happened. The man on the trailer screamed, a high-pitched wail that sent chills down my spine. He disappeared over the side and the others froze, looking around nervously. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. A shadow moving impossibly fast, darting between the men. One by one, they dropped, their screams echoing through the night. "Drive!" Ray yelled. "I can't. The truck won't start." The shadows closed in around us, taking shape. They looked human, but their limbs were too long, their movements too jerky. One of them stopped in front of the truck, staring at us with glowing eyes. Ray was shaking, her voice barely a whisper. "What the hell are those things?" "Skinwalkers," I said, the word tasting bitter in my mouth. One of them slammed a hand against the windshield, cracking the glass. I grabbed the pouch of corn pollen I kept in the glove box, a gift from my grandfather, who told me it would protect me in times of trouble. "Hold this," I told Ray, handing her the flashlight. I opened the pouch and sprinkled the pollen across the dashboard, muttering a Navajo prayer under my breath. The creatures recoiled, their glowing eyes narrowing. The one at the windshield let out a piercing screech and backed away. The truck roared to life, the engine finally turning over. I didn't hesitate, slamming it into gear and flooring it. The creatures chased us for a few terrifying seconds, but the further we got, the more they faded into the darkness. By the time we reached the next town, the sun was rising. We stopped at a diner, shaken but alive. The side of the rig was covered in deep claw marks, glowing faintly in the dawn light. That was the last time I drove US 491. I burned the marked section of the trailer just to be safe. Ray never joked about skinwalkers again. And me? I still see them in my nightmares, those glowing eyes watching from the shadows. Some roads you don't take twice. My name is Maggie Reyes. I'm 42 years old, and I've been driving trucks for almost 15 years. I got into this line of work after burning out as a paramedic, a job that left me with too many scars, both the kind you can see and the kind you can't. These days, I prefer the solitude of the open road, but last summer, I learned that some things you can't outrun. This happened on a long haul across Interstate 40. I was hauling a load of fresh produce from Bakersfield to Oklahoma City, trying to make up for lost time after a blown tire delayed me by half a day. The dispatcher wasn't happy, but I wasn't about to rush and risk another problem. Trucking isn't glamorous, but I take pride in doing it right. The trouble started in the Arizona desert, just east of Flagstaff. My truck's temperature gauge spiked out of nowhere, and I had to pull over to let the engine cool down. The stretch of highway was empty. No other vehicles, no towns, nothing but scrubby desert and the sound of the wind. After about 20 minutes, the needle dropped back into the safe zone and I climbed back into the cab, muttering a prayer to the diesel gods. The storm hit just after sunset. One moment the sky was clear. The next, a wall of black clouds rolled in, swallowing the last of the light. Lightning flashed in the distance, turning the desert into a landscape of sharp, fleeting shadows. The rain came down in sheets, drumming on the roof of the cab so loud I could barely hear the engine. Visibility dropped to almost nothing, and the road disappeared under a river of water and mud. I slowed to a crawl, gripping the wheel tight enough to make my knuckles ache. That's when I saw him. He was standing on the shoulder of the highway, drenched and waving both arms like he was trying to flag down a lifeboat. Even through the rain, I could see he was wearing a black suit. Strange for someone hitchhiking in the middle of nowhere. I should have kept driving. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to just keep going, but something about the way he stood there, soaking and desperate, reminded me of people I used to pull out of car wrecks. Against my better judgment, I pulled over and rolled down the window just enough to shout through the storm. "You need a ride?" I called. The man nodded. "Thank you," he said. His voice calm and even, like he wasn't bothered by the rain. "I appreciate your kindness." He climbed into the cab without another word, settling into the passenger seat with an odd, deliberate grace. Up close, he was even stranger. His suit was immaculate, not a thread out of place despite the storm. His face was sharp and pale, his dark eyes glittering in the dim light. He didn't carry a bag or any belongings, just himself. "What's your name?" I asked, keeping my tone light as I eased the truck back onto the highway. "Call me Victor," he said. "And you are Maggie." I felt a jolt of surprise. "How'd you know that?" Victor smiled faintly. "I saw it on your dashboard nameplate." I glanced at the plate. It was small, barely legible in the dark. Either he had sharp eyes, or he'd been paying very close attention. I didn't like either option, but I let it slide. I figured he was just another oddball, and I'd drop him off at the next truck stop. "Where are you headed?" I asked. "Wherever you're going," he replied. That didn't sit right with me. Most hitchhikers have a destination in mind, even if it's vague. But Victor just stared out the windshield, his expression unreadable. We drove in silence for a while, the storm easing into a steady drizzle. Then the weirdness started. First, my gauges began to glitch. The speedometer jumped between 30 and 70, even though I was holding steady at 50. The temperature needle swung wildly, climbing into the red before dropping back to normal. I tapped the glass, thinking it might be a short, but the gauges kept flickering. Then the CB radio crackled to life. "Turn back," a voice whispered through the static. "Maggie, turn back." I froze. No one had used my name over the CB. My heart pounded as I grabbed the mic. "Who is this?" I demanded. No answer. Just static and then silence. I glanced at Victor. He didn't seem to notice, his gaze fixed on the road ahead. My skin crawled. Something about this man was wrong. His presence felt heavy, like the air in the cab had grown thicker since he'd climbed in. I stopped at a truck stop near Holbrook, intending to let Victor out. The place was run down, with flickering neon lights and a parking lot full of potholes. A handful of other truckers lingered inside, swapping stories over bad coffee. Victor didn't move to get out. He just sat there, watching me with that faint, unsettling smile. "Aren't you getting out?" I asked. "No need," he said. "I'll wait here." I didn't like the idea of leaving him alone in my truck, but I needed a minute to think. I stepped into the diner, my boots squelching on the sticky floor, and grabbed a cup of coffee. One of the older truckers, a wiry man with a grizzled beard, nodded at me. "Rough night?" he asked. "You could say that," I replied. "Picked up a hitchhiker back on the highway. Guy's giving me the creeps." The trucker frowned. "You sure that was a good idea? A lot of folks have gone missing along this stretch. Some say it's cartels. Others say it's something else." "Something else?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. He leaned closer. "They call him the Devil's Hitchhiker. A man in black, shows up during storms. Folks who pick him up, they don't come back." I laughed it off, but his words stuck with me as I climbed back into the cab. Victor was exactly where I'd left him, his hands folded neatly in his lap. "You ready to go?" he asked. I didn't answer. My instinct screamed to leave him, but my sense of duty wouldn't let me abandon someone on the road. I put the truck in gear, telling myself I'd drop him off at the first major town. As we drove, Victor started talking. His voice was low and smooth, each word measured and deliberate. "You've seen death, haven't you, Maggie?" he said. I tightened my grip on the wheel. "Everyone has." "Not like you," he pressed. "You've carried it, felt its weight. It's why you left your old job, isn't it? The boy in the crash." My breath caught. No one knew about that. I'd never told anyone, not even my family, about the boy I couldn't save. His face haunted my nightmares. But how could Victor know? "I don't know what you're talking about," I said, my voice shaky. Victor smiled, a flash of teeth in the dark. "I can help you, Maggie. I can take the pain away. All you have to do is say yes." I slammed on the brakes, the truck skidding to a stop in the middle of the highway. "Get out," I snapped. "Now!" Victor didn't move. His eyes glowed faintly, like embers, and the cab filled with the smell of sulfur. "You don't want me to leave," he said. "Not yet." The lights in the cab flickered, and the gauges spun wildly. The truck began to shake. A deep, bone-rattling vibration that felt like the world was coming apart. I reached for my crowbar, but Victor was faster. He grabbed my wrist, his grip icy and inhumanly strong. "You can't fight me, Maggie," he said, "but you can choose. Will you carry your guilt forever, or will you let me take it?" Desperate, I did the only thing I could think of. I jammed the accelerator, sending the truck roaring down the highway. The vibrations grew worse, the engine screaming as if it were alive. Victor's face twisted, his calm mask slipping to reveal something monstrous, his eyes burning red, his teeth sharp and jagged. I swerved off the road, aiming for a dry riverbed. At the last second, I threw open the door and jumped, hitting the ground hard and rolling to a stop. The truck barreled onward, plunging into the darkness with Victor still inside. I lay there for what felt like hours, staring at the empty sky. When I finally made it back to the highway, there was no sign of the truck or Victor. Just an eerie silence, broken only by the whisper of the wind. A passing driver picked me up and took me to the nearest town. The authorities didn't believe my story, chalking it up to exhaustion and an overactive imagination. But I know what I saw. I know what I survived. Now, every time I see a hitchhiker, I keep driving. Some burdens aren't worth carrying. My name is Sam Callahan. I'm 34 years old, and I've been driving trucks for nearly a decade. People call me lucky. but after what happened last summer, I don't feel so lucky anymore. This story takes place on U.S. Route 50, a stretch of highway running through the middle of nowhere in Nevada. They call it the loneliest road in America. I thought that was just a marketing gimmick to scare tourists. Turns out, there's a lot of truth in the name. It started with a rush job. I'd been tasked with hauling a load of medical supplies to a hospital in Salt Lake City. They were desperate, needed the shipment ASAP, and I figured I could shave a few hours off the trip by taking Route 50 instead of sticking to the interstates. It's a gamble, sure, but I've always liked a challenge. I left Ely, Nevada just before noon with a full tank of diesel and my lucky rabbit's foot dangling from the rearview mirror. The first couple of hours were fine, just me, the desert, and the hum of the engine. But as the miles ticked by, I started noticing things that didn't sit right. The first sign of trouble was the fuel gauge. I'd filled up less than an hour before, but the needle was already dropping faster than it should have. I pulled over at a beat-up gas station just outside of Eureka to top off and check for leaks. The place was barely standing. Peeling paint, a flickering neon open sign, and a single pump that looked like it hadn't been serviced since the Carter administration. The attendant was an old guy with sun-weathered skin and a cigarette dangling from his lips. He didn't say much until I asked him about the road ahead. "Route 50, huh?" he said, squinting at me like I'd just announced I was walking into a minefield. "Better watch yourself out there. You ever hear of the Phantom Convoy?" "The what?" I asked, trying to keep the skepticism out of my voice. 3 trucks, he said, leaning closer. "Black, no plates. They'll tail you, box you in. Sometimes they're just a scare. Other times..." He trailed off, tapping the side of his head like it was obvious. I forced a chuckle. "Sounds like you've been watching too many horror movies." He didn't laugh. "Just keep your eyes open, and don't stop for anything." I hit the road again, shaking off the old man's warning. Superstitions and ghost stories didn't scare me. I'd seen my fair share of strange things on the road, accidents, weirdos, even a tornado once. I figured this would just be another tale to tell at the truck stop. Then the dust storm rolled in. One second the horizon was clear, and the next I was surrounded by a swirling wall of grit and sand. Visibility dropped to 0, and the wind howled like a pack of wolves. I had no choice but to pull over and wait it out. The storm lasted for hours, and by the time it passed, the sun was setting, and I was way behind schedule. That's when I saw them. The trucks. They appeared in my mirrors. 3 sets of headlights far off in the distance. At first, I thought it was just another convoy, maybe some other truckers taking the same shortcut. But as the miles went by, they didn't get closer. They just stayed there, hovering on the edge of visibility, like they were following me. The CB radio crackled to life around midnight. At first, it was just static, but then I heard a voice, a man's voice, faint and distorted, like it was coming from a bad dream. "Sam." I froze. My name, clear as day. I hadn't touched the radio in hours. "Turn back, Sam." The voice was familiar, but I couldn't place it. Then it hit me. It sounded like Mark, my old driving partner. He'd died 5 years ago in a crash outside of Denver. There's no way it could have been him, but the resemblance was uncanny. I grabbed the mic. "Who is this? How do you know my name?" Static. Then silence. Things got worse from there. My GPS, which had been working fine all day, suddenly went haywire. It kept rerouting me, telling me to take an unmarked dirt road that didn't exist. When I ignored it, the screen went blank, then flashed a set of coordinates. I didn't recognize them, but the thought of blindly following those numbers sent a chill down my spine. The trucks behind me were still there, but now they were closer. Close enough that I could make out their shapes. Dark, boxy rigs with no logos, no plates, and headlights that burned way too bright. I picked up speed, hoping to lose them, but they matched me turn for turn, mile for mile. My fuel gauge was dropping again, faster than it should have. By the time I reached a straight stretch of road, the needle was hovering over empty, even though I'd filled up twice. I couldn't figure it out. There were no leaks, no smell of diesel. It was like the fuel was just disappearing. The trucks made their move about 20 miles west of Austin, Nevada. They sped up, flanking me on both sides and cutting off my escape. Their engines roared, drowning out everything else. I could feel the vibrations through the cab, like the whole world was closing in on me. I grabbed the CB mic again, desperate. "Whoever you are, back off. I don't want any trouble." No response. One of the trucks swerved into my lane, forcing me to slam on the brakes. My rig shuddered, and I fought to keep it under control. The lead truck slowed to a crawl, boxing me in. That's when I saw the driver. Or rather, the lack of one. The cab was empty. No driver, no passenger. Just an empty seat and a steering wheel turning on its own. I panicked, I admit it. I slammed the gas pedal and jerked the wheel, pulling off the highway and onto the desert sand. The rig bucked and jolted, and I heard something crack. Probably an axle, but I didn't care. I just needed to get away. The phantom trucks didn't follow me off-road, but I wasn't safe yet. My headlights caught the outline of an old building up ahead. A truck stop, long abandoned. The windows were boarded up, and the sign was faded beyond recognition, but it was shelter. I pulled up beside it and killed the engine. Inside, the air was stale and heavy, like the place hadn't been touched in decades. Dust covered everything, but there were signs of recent activity. Boot prints on the floor, a half-empty water bottle on the counter. I ventured deeper and found a small office. The desk was cluttered with papers, maps, and something that made my blood run cold, a stack of photographs. They were all of trucks, wrecked rigs, burned-out husks, some with bloodstains still visible on the seats. And in every photo, there was a black truck in the background, watching. I didn't have time to process it. The sound of engines roared outside louder than before. The phantom convoy had found me. I bolted back to the cab, fumbling with the ignition. The engine sputtered, coughed, and died. They were coming, their headlights piercing the darkness like searchlights. I grabbed my crowbar from the back seat and climbed out, heart pounding. "Come on, you bastards," I shouted, more bravado than courage. "Let's get this over with." The trucks didn't move. They just sat there, idling, their engines growling like wild animals. Then, one by one, their headlights went out, leaving me in total darkness. I don't remember much after that. Just flashes, running through the desert. The sound of my own ragged breathing. Those trucks always right behind me, no matter how fast or far I ran. At some point, I must have passed out, because the next thing I knew it was morning, and I was lying on the shoulder of the highway. A sheriff's deputy found me, dehydrated and delirious. He didn't believe my story, of course. Said I'd probably fallen asleep at the wheel and imagined the whole thing. But when we went back to where I'd left my rig, it was gone. No sign of the phantom trucks, no sign of the truck stop, no sign of anything. I still drive, but I don't take Route 50 anymore. I don't even talk about it, except to warn other truckers when I can. The road is dangerous enough without adding ghosts to the mix. And if you ever hear about the phantom convoy, do yourself a favor. Stay far, far away. My name is Jake Thompson. I'm 48 years old, and I've been trucking for over 2 decades. In all my years on the road, I've never faced anything like what happened on Deadman's Curve. This was back in October of 2021, and I remember every detail like it was yesterday. I was on a haul from Cincinnati to a mining town deep in the mountains of West Virginia. It was a route I didn't much like, too many steep grades, hairpin turns, and long stretches of nothing. But it paid well, and the kid I was mentoring, Ryan Delgado, needed the experience. He was 27, eager to learn, and good with a wrench, which made him handy in this line of work. We were hauling industrial equipment for a coal operation. Heavy stuff, and the deadline was tight. We hit Route 33 around 5 p.m., just as the sun was dipping below the mountains. The rig was running smooth until Ryan tapped my shoulder. "Jake," he said, "the air pressure gauge is acting funny. You think it's the brakes?" I glanced at the gauge. It was low, too low. Not good on mountain roads. I pulled over at the next wide spot and had Ryan crawl under the rig to check it out. "It's a leak," he called out. "Looks like a busted line. I can patch it, but it won't hold long." "Do what you can," I told him. Ryan did a quick patch job, but we both knew it wouldn't last. Still, we had to keep moving. The client was expecting the load by morning, and there weren't any repair shops nearby. We rolled out cautiously, keeping our speed low, especially on the descents. As the sun disappeared, a storm rolled in. The rain came fast and hard, turning the road slick. The fog was the worst part. Thick as soup, it swallowed the headlights and made every curve a blind turn. We passed an old pickup truck abandoned on the shoulder. A man waved us down, his face pale in the glow of our lights. Something about him didn't sit right. He wasn't wearing a coat, and his clothes looked old, like something out of the 80s. "You want to stop?" Ryan asked. I shook my head. "No way, too dangerous to stop on this road." Ryan nodded, but he kept craning his neck to look back. When I glanced in the side mirror, the man was gone. The truck was still there, rusted and beat up, like it had been sitting for years. "That was weird," Ryan muttered. "Weirder if you start thinking about it," I said, trying to keep him focused. We hit a gas station around 9 p.m., one of those rundown places with flickering lights and a clerk who looked like he hadn't seen daylight in a decade. "Where are you boys headed?" the clerk asked as he rang up my coffee. "Mining town up the mountain," I said. The clerk froze. "You taking Dead Man's Curve?" "If that's the road up there, yeah," I replied. He looked at me like I'd just signed my own death warrant. "Best keep your speed down and don't stop for nobody. Not after dark." "What's that supposed to mean?" Ryan asked. But the clerk just shook his head and handed me my change. I didn't press him. Superstitions run deep in these parts, and I wasn't about to get caught up in local ghost stories. We climbed back into the cab and rolled out. The first sign of trouble came about 5 miles up the road. Something darted across the highway just outside the reach of the headlights. It was fast, too fast for an animal, and tall. "Did you see that?" Ryan asked, gripping the armrest. "Probably a deer," I lied. "Deer don't run on 2 legs," he shot back. I didn't answer, but I felt the hair on my neck stand up. A few minutes later, the rig jolted like we'd hit something. I pulled over to check, but there was nothing on the road. Just as I was climbing back into the cab, I noticed something in the mud by the shoulder. Footprints. Big ones, with long, clawed toes. "Jake?" Ryan called from the cab. "Yeah," I said, brushing it off. "Just a pothole. Let's keep moving." By the time we hit Dead Man's Curve, the fog was so thick I could barely see the hood of the truck. The road twisted sharply, hugging the mountain like a coiled snake. The patched brakes were holding, but I didn't trust them. Then we saw them. Figures, standing in the fog. At first, I thought they were trees, but trees don't have glowing eyes. There were 4, maybe 5 of them, all standing, perfectly still, just watching us. "Jake," Ryan whispered, his voice trembling. "I see them," I said, gripping the wheel tighter. "Don't look at them, just keep your eyes on the road." As we passed, the figures turned their heads, following us with their glowing eyes. One of them raised an arm, long and skeletal, and pointed at the truck. The air pressure gauge dropped again, and the brakes started to hiss. "Not now," I muttered, pumping the pedal. We made it another half-mile before the brakes gave out completely. I wrestled the rig to a stop on a narrow shoulder. Ryan jumped out to check the line, but I stayed in the cab, scanning the fog for any sign of those figures. When Ryan came back, his face was pale. "It's shot, Jake. We're not going anywhere unless you've got a spare airline in your pocket." I grabbed the flare gun from the glove box and climbed out. "We'll wait here. Someone will come along." "Out here?" Ryan asked, his voice cracking. "I don't see another option." We didn't have to wait long. A set of headlights appeared in the distance, cutting through the fog. But as the vehicle approached, it slowed to a crawl, and I realized it wasn't a rescue. It was a group of trucks, 3 of them, old and battered with no plates. They stopped just ahead of us and men climbed out. They weren't locals. Their clothes were clean, and their faces were hard. One of them carried a shotgun. "Stay in the cab," I told Ryan. The leader approached, a tall man with a scar running from his temple to his jaw. "You boys need help?" he asked, his voice dripping with fake kindness. "We're fine," I said, keeping the flare gun out of sight. "Sure about that?" he asked, looking past me at the trailer. "Looks like you're carrying some valuable cargo." That's when I realized this wasn't random. They'd spiked the road. We'd been set up. Before I could react, the figures from the fog appeared behind the men. At first, I thought they were working together, but then I saw the look of fear in the men's eyes. The creatures moved fast, their long limbs stretching unnaturally. One of the men screamed as a clawed hand grabbed him and dragged him into the fog. The others opened fire, but the bullets didn't seem to do anything. "Get in the cab," I shouted, firing the flare gun. The light burned bright, and the creatures recoiled, hissing. Ryan and I scrambled into the truck and locked the doors. The men outside were yelling, shooting into the fog, but it was no use. One by one, they were pulled into the shadows. The creatures turned their attention to us. They surrounded the truck, tapping on the windows and clawing at the doors. Ryan was panicking, but I kept my focus. "Grab the flashlight," I ordered. "What good is that gonna do?" "Just do it." He handed me the flashlight, and I flicked it on, shining the beam directly at the nearest creature. It shrieked and backed off, its glowing eyes dimming. "They don't like the light," I said. "We've got to make a run for it." We bolted from the cab, using the flashlight and flares to keep the creatures at bay. Ryan spotted a trail leading down the mountain, and we took it, stumbling through the mud and rain. The creatures followed, but they stayed just outside the light. We ran until our legs gave out, finally collapsing on the shoulder of another road. A sheriff's cruiser pulled up minutes later. The deputy took one look at us and shook his head. "You boys have a rough night?" he asked. "You could say that," I replied. He gave us a ride to the nearest town, but warned us not to tell anyone what we'd seen. "Folks around here don't like outsiders stirring up trouble," he said. The next morning, we went back for the rig, but it was gone. The sheriff said it must have rolled off the mountain in the storm, but I knew better. Ryan quit trucking after that, said the road wasn't for him. Can't say I blame him, me. I'm still out here, hauling loads and telling myself it was just a bad night. But every time I pass a foggy mountain road, I grip the wheel a little tighter, because I know they're still out there waiting. My name is Frank Wallace, and I'm 54 years old. I've been driving trucks for over 30 years, long enough to see plenty of tough runs and even tougher weather. But there's one night I'll never forget, and it happened last winter. They sent me up Snoqualmie Pass on I-90 during one of the worst blizzards I've ever seen. I thought it'd be another routine haul, hard, sure, but nothing I couldn't handle. I was wrong. It started in Ellensburg, Washington. I'd been sitting in the lot for hours, waiting for dispatch to finalize the paperwork for a load of emergency food supplies bound for a ski resort up in the mountains. The storm was already building when I finally got the green light. They told me the resort was cut off by snow and low on food, so this was a priority run. The kind that paid well, even if the risks were high. I didn't argue. I needed the money, and I've never been one to back down from a challenge. "Watch yourself on Snoqualmie," the dispatcher said as I climbed into my cab. "The pass is a mess. They're saying whiteout conditions, multiple accidents. If you need to pull over, do it. No load's worth your life." I nodded, but I was already thinking ahead. I'd crossed Snoqualmie dozens of times in worse weather, or so I told myself. By the time I hit the base of the mountain, the storm was in full swing. Snow piled up faster than my wipers could clear it, and the road was slick with ice. Visibility was near zero, just the glow of my headlights cutting through the white, the rest of the world swallowed by the blizzard. I chained up my tires at a rest area and pressed on. The hum of the engine and the crunch of snow under the wheels were the only sounds, aside from the occasional squawk of the CB. Most of the other truckers had pulled off to wait out the storm. I was alone on the road, and the silence felt heavy, pressing against me like a weight. That's when I noticed the tracks. They crossed the road just ahead of me, huge, clawed prints, too big to be a dog or a cougar. I slowed down, my headlights sweeping across the snow, but whatever made them was long gone. My chest tightened, but I shook it off. Mountain wildlife. Nothing to get spooked about. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The storm seemed quieter here, the wind less fierce. The air felt wrong, like the mountain was holding its breath, waiting. I was nearing Dead Man's Corner, a sharp, hairpin turn just before the summit, when my CB crackled to life. At first, it was just static, but then a voice cut through. "Help! I'm stuck! At the old lodge!" The voice was weak, panicked. A trucker in trouble, I figured. But something about it sounded strange. Off, I grabbed the mic. "This is Big Rig. What's your location?" No response. Just static. And then the voice again, faint and distorted. "The lodge. Help." I frowned, glancing at the map spread out on the seat beside me. I knew these roads, but I didn't remember any lodge. The storm was playing tricks on my nerves. I told myself to focus and kept climbing. Dead Man's Corner lived up to its name. The road curved sharply, and one wrong move would send you sliding into the ravine below. As I rounded the bend, my headlights caught something on the side of the road, a trucker's jacket, torn and half buried in the snow. It was stained dark, and I didn't need a closer look to know it was blood. I hit the brakes, my tires skidding on the icy road. The rig groaned as it came to a stop, and I sat there for a moment, gripping the wheel, my breath fogging up the cab. A cold knot of dread twisted in my gut. Then I saw it, the lodge. It wasn't on the map, and I'd never seen it before. A squat, weathered building set back from the road, its windows dark except for a faint flicker of light from inside. A sign above the door hung crooked, the paint faded and peeling. The voice on the CB came back, louder this time. "Help, the lodge." Against every instinct screaming at me to keep driving, I pulled into the lot. My rig's headlights illuminated the building, casting long, jagged shadows across the snow. I killed the engine and stepped out into the storm, the cold biting through my jacket. The snow muffled every sound, making the world feel small and closed. Inside, the lodge was eerily quiet. The air was stale, and the floorboards creaked under my boots. There were signs that someone had been here recently, a half-eaten meal on the counter, muddy footprints leading upstairs. I called out, my voice echoing in the empty space. "Anyone here? Hello?" No answer. I followed the footprints, climbing the narrow staircase. The steps groaned under my weight, and the light from my flashlight danced across the walls. At the top of the stairs, I found a small room with a single bed, its sheets rumpled and stained. A CB radio sat on the nightstand, its speaker crackling with static. That's when I heard it. The sound of heavy footsteps outside, crunching through the snow. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. I moved to the window and peered out. At first, I couldn't see anything. Just the swirling snow, the dim glow of the truck's headlights cutting through the storm. Then, something moved. A massive, shadowy figure, taller than any man, with glowing eyes that burned like coals. It circled my rig, its movements slow and deliberate. I ducked back from the window, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. My mind raced, grasping for explanations. An animal? A trick of the light? But deep down, I knew better. The footsteps stopped and the silence was deafening. I stayed still, every muscle tensed, waiting. Then the lodge shook. The figure slammed into the building with a force that rattled the windows and sent dust raining from the ceiling. I stumbled back, nearly dropping my flashlight. The walls groaned as it hit again. The sound a deep, guttural thud that reverberated through the floor. I ran. I bolted down the stairs and out the door, the cold air hitting me like a slap. The figure turned toward me, its glowing eyes locking onto mine. It didn't move, but I could feel its presence, heavy, oppressive, like a weight pressing down on my chest. I dove into the cab and slammed the door, locking it. My hands fumbled for the key, but when I turned it, nothing happened. The engine was dead. The figure approached, its footsteps slow and deliberate. It reached the truck and placed a massive hand on the hood, leaving a trail of frost in its wake. The air inside the cab grew colder, and my breath fogged up the glass. I grabbed a tire iron from the floor and held it tight, though I knew it wouldn't do much good. Then the voice came back, not from the CB this time, but from the figure itself. "Why, are you here?" The words were low and guttural, barely human. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. "I'm just passing through, delivering supplies." The figure tilted its head, studying me. "You don't belong here." I didn't know what to say. My hands trembled as I gripped the tire iron, my knuckles white. The figure leaned closer, its glowing eyes filling the windshield. Turned back, and just like that it was gone. The storm seemed to lift, the snow easing into a light flurry. My breath steadied, and I turned the key again. This time, the engine roared to life. I didn't waste a second. I threw the rig into gear and tore out of the lot, the tires skidding on the icy road. I delivered the supplies to the resort just before dawn. The staff thanked me, their relief palpable, but I barely heard them. My mind was still on the lodge, the shadowy figure, and the voice that echoed in my head. Later, I asked around about the lodge, but no one knew anything about it. It wasn't on any map, and none of the other truckers had ever seen it. But I knew what I saw, and I knew one thing for sure. I'd never take Snoqualmie Pass in a storm again. My name is Jesse Liu, and I'm 29 years old. This happened last winter, just after I got my CDL and landed my first solo haul. It was supposed to be a routine drive, a quick run hauling medical supplies from Albuquerque, New Mexico to Flagstaff, Arizona. I'd spent months training, shadowing other drivers, and waiting for this chance to prove I could handle the road on my own. But what happened that night on Route 491, a stretch of highway they call the Devil's Highway, made me question whether trucking was worth it at all. It started like any other trip. I picked up my rig in Albuquerque just as the sun was setting, loaded up with crates of medical supplies bound for a hospital in Flagstaff. Dispatch warned me about icy conditions in the Four Corners region and told me to be extra careful on Dead Man's Curve, a tight bend near Shiprock notorious for fatal accidents. I nodded, feigned confidence, and hit the road. By the time I reached Shiprock, night had fallen, and the highway stretched out like an endless ribbon of asphalt under a pale moon. The truck rolled smooth, the engine's hum steady. I felt good, maybe a little too good. I flipped through stations on the radio until I landed on a true crime podcast. The host's voice was calm and clinical as he described unsolved disappearances on Route 491. A hitchhiker who vanished without a trace. A trucker who stopped for a stranded car and was never seen again. The stories sent a little shiver up my spine, but I laughed it off. I mean, ghost stories are part of the trucking culture, right? Keeps things interesting. Still, I couldn't shake the unease. At the Shiprock loading dock, an older trucker named Hank noticed my jitters. "You're running solo on 491?" he asked, frowning. His face was weathered, the kind of face that seemed like it had seen everything. "Be careful on Dead Man's Curve, and don't stop for anyone." I shrugged it off with a smile. Thanks for the tip. But Hank wasn't smiling. He gripped my arm, his expression grave. "I mean it. That highway's got its share of shadows and not all of them are human." I laughed nervously and climbed into the cab, eager to put some miles between me and Hank's ominous warning. I was about 20 miles past Shiprock when the first strange thing happened. The CB radio crackled to life, though I hadn't touched it. At first, it was static, but then a voice came through. It was my voice, only distorted, echoing, like a recording played in reverse. "Help me," the voice whispered. I froze, gripping the wheel tighter. My mind raced for a logical explanation. Interference, I told myself. Just some trucker messing around. I reached for the CB to turn it off, but it went silent on its own. The highway stretched ahead, empty and dark, and I forced myself to focus on the road. That's when I saw the dog. It came out of nowhere, a black shape darting across the road. I swerved hard, the tires screeching as the rig fishtailed. My heart pounded as I fought to regain control. When I finally stopped, I sat there trembling, my breath fogging up the windshield. I looked in the rearview mirror, expecting to see the dog limping off into the darkness. But there was nothing. No movement, no body, just the endless expanse of desert. Shaking it off, I put the truck in gear and pressed on. I told myself I was imagining things, that the stories on the podcast had gotten into my head, but deep down, I felt the unease settling in, like a shadow stretching across my mind. By the time I reached Dead Man's Curve, the fog had rolled in, thick and heavy. It clung to the highway, swallowing the headlights and turning the road into a tunnel of gray. My palms were slick on the wheel as I slowed to a crawl, the truck groaning with the effort of climbing the incline. And then I saw him. A man stood on the shoulder, just ahead of the curve. He was wearing a faded jacket and holding a duffel bag. His face was hard to make out in the dim light, but I could see enough to know he wasn't smiling. He raised one hand, waving me down. Every instinct screamed at me to keep driving, but something about him, the way he stood so still, the duffel bag hanging limply at his side, made me hesitate. Against my better judgment, I slowed down, my foot hovering over the brake. As I got closer, he turned his head to look at me, and I caught a glimpse of his face. His eyes were pale, almost colorless, and his skin had a waxy, lifeless sheen. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end. I hit the gas, speeding past him and around the curve. That's when everything went wrong. The dashboard lights flickered and the engine sputtered, a horrible coughing sound that made my stomach drop. The truck lurched forward once, then died. leaving me coasting downhill with no power. I managed to pull onto the shoulder, the rig shuddering to a stop. The silence was deafening. No hum of the engine, no crackle of the CB, just the muffled sound of the wind outside. I reached for my phone, but, of course, there was no signal. I cursed under my breath and climbed out to check the engine. The air was freezing, biting through my jacket as I popped the hood and peered inside. Everything looked normal. No broken belts, no obvious leaks. But the engine wouldn't start. I climbed back into the cab, frustrated and shivering, and that's when I saw him again. The man from the roadside was standing under the flickering lamp of an old rest stop sign about 50 yards away. He didn't move, didn't wave this time. He just stood there, staring at me with those pale, dead eyes. My heart pounded in my chest. I locked the doors and turned off the interior lights, hoping he wouldn't notice me. For a moment, I thought he was gone, but then a new sound filled the air. Engines. 2 of them. A pair of pickup trucks pulled into the rest stop, their headlights off. They were beat-up vehicles, their grills dented and their windshields dirty. My stomach sank as 2 men climbed out, both burly and rough-looking. One carried a crowbar, the other a flashlight. They approached my truck, their boots crunching on the gravel. "Hey there," one of them called out. "You need some help?" I didn't answer. My fingers trembled as I reached for my phone again, hoping for even a sliver of service. Still nothing. The man with the flashlight tapped on the window. "Come on now, don't be shy." When I didn't respond, the other one swung the crowbar, shattering the passenger side mirror. I screamed, scrambling for the safety latch on the driver's side door. But before I could move, something else happened. The whispers came back. This time, they were louder, angrier. The men froze, looking around in confusion as the air grew colder, the fog thickening around us. The whispers seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, overlapping voices that spoke in a language I couldn't understand. The man with the flashlight dropped it, his eyes wide with terror. "What the hell is that?" he muttered. And then he screamed. A shadow rose behind him, impossibly tall and twisting, its form shifting like smoke. The other man swung the crowbar at it, but the weapon passed through harmlessly. The shadow lunged, and both men were thrown backward as if struck by an invisible force. They scrambled to their feet and ran, disappearing into the fog. I sat there, shaking, as the shadow turned toward me. For a moment I thought it would attack, but instead it began to shrink, collapsing in on itself until it took the shape of the man from the roadside. He walked toward the cab, his steps slow and deliberate, and I was too frozen with fear to do anything but watch. When he reached the door, he spoke. His voice was low and hollow, like wind through an empty canyon. "Keep driving," he said, "and don't stop for anyone, not here, not ever." And just like that, he vanished. The engine roared to life on its own. I didn't question it. I slammed the truck into gear and sped off, not caring about the ice or the fog. I didn't stop until I reached Flagstaff, where I delivered the medical supplies and parked the rig. I didn't tell anyone about what happened, not the dispatcher, not the other drivers at the yard. I knew they wouldn't believe me. But every time I pass a hitchhiker now, I hear the shadow's voice in my head. Don't stop for anyone. My name is Jack Logan, and I'm 52 years old. I've been driving trucks for nearly 3 decades, long enough to see every kind of danger the open road can throw at you. But nothing prepared me for what happened one bitter cold night on I-80, crossing the high desert of Nevada. This was last winter, just before Christmas. I was hauling a load of fresh produce from Sacramento to Salt Lake City, trying to make up time after some unexpected delays. Looking back, I should have listened to my gut. The trouble started before I even hit the road. My Kenworth was acting up. grinding every time I shifted gears. I knew the differential was wearing out, but there wasn't time for a full repair. My dispatcher promised me this was an easy run. Straight roads, no heavy traffic. I convinced myself I could push through, get the delivery done, and deal with the repairs in Salt Lake. That night, the desert stretched out like an endless black ribbon. The moon a pale coin in the sky. I just fueled up in Lovelock, a dusty little town that always seemed a step away from being swallowed by the sands. At the truck stop, I overheard some locals talking about disappearances along the highway. They mentioned ghost stories, phantom hitchhikers, and warnings not to drive alone at night. I laughed it off. Truckers love swapping spooky tales, but I've always been a show-me-the-evidence kind of guy. Still, their words stuck with me as I pulled out of town, the hum of my engine the only sound in the stillness. It was around midnight when I first saw her. She stood on the shoulder, just past Battle Mountain, under a flickering highway lamp. A young woman, maybe mid-20s, wearing a red hoodie and jeans. She waved as I approached, her face pale and strained in the harsh light. My first instinct was to keep driving. Hitchhikers can be trouble, and company policy forbids picking them up. But something about her stopped me. Maybe it was the way she looked at me, desperate but calm, like she knew I'd stop. I rolled down the window. "Need a ride?" "My car broke down," she said, her voice soft but steady. "I just need to get to Salt Lake, please." I hesitated. Something about her seemed off. But leaving someone stranded in the middle of nowhere didn't sit right with me either. Against my better judgment, I opened the door. "Hop in," I said, "but just to Salt Lake." "Thank you," she said, climbing into the cab. She introduced herself as Anna and sat quietly, hands folded in her lap. Her presence felt strange, not threatening, but unsettling. She didn't have the usual nervous chatter of someone catching a ride with a stranger. Instead, she sat there like she belonged, humming a low, haunting tune. The melody tugged at something deep in my memory, but I couldn't place it. "You from around here?" I asked, trying to break the silence. "No," she said simply. "Where's your car?" "Back there," she gestured vaguely behind us. "It doesn't matter anymore." That answer didn't sit right, but I let it go. We rolled on through the night, the rhythmic thrum of the engine filling the silence. After a while, I glanced over at her. Her face was turned toward the window, staring into the darkness. "Something wrong?" I asked. She turned back to me and smiled, a small, almost sad smile. "You should turn back." "What?" "You shouldn't be out here tonight." A chill ran down my spine. "What are you talking about?" Before she could answer, the CB crackled to life. At first, it was static, then garbled voices. I caught snippets. "Danger. Phantom Rider. Leave her." The transmission ended abruptly, leaving a heavy silence in its wake. I tried to shake it off. CB radios pick up all kinds of weird interference, especially in the middle of nowhere. But as I gripped the wheel tighter, I couldn't ignore the knot forming in my stomach. The first real scare came about an hour later. As we climbed Pequot Summit, the grinding in my differential got worse. I pulled over to check it out, flipping on my hazard lights. Anna stayed in the cab, silent as ever. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped into the freezing night air. The problem was worse than I thought. My brake lines had been tampered with, slashed clean through. Someone had done this deliberately. Heart pounding, I scanned the area with my flashlight. There was no one around, just the empty desert and the whisper of the wind. But when I turned back toward the truck, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Anna was standing in the middle of the road, illuminated by my headlights. Her red hoodie billowed in the breeze, and she was staring down the highway completely still. I shouted her name, but she didn't move. Then, as if on cue, a pair of headlights appeared in the distance, speeding toward us. A black SUV. "Get back in the truck," I yelled. Anna turned to me, her face calm but unyielding. "They're here for you." "What the hell are you talking about?" I demanded, grabbing her arm. She didn't resist, but let me guide her back to the cab. The SUV slowed as it passed, its tinted windows glinting under my lights. It didn't stop, but I could feel the malice radiating from it, like a predator circling its prey. My instincts screamed at me to get moving. Back in the cab, I slammed the door and fired up the engine. "What's going on, Anna? Who are they?" "They're not the ones you should be afraid of," she said cryptically. Her words only added to my frustration. I didn't have time to argue. I needed to get out of there. The brakes might have been damaged, but the rig could still roll. I put it in gear and pushed forward, keeping one eye on the rearview mirror. That's when the real nightmare began. The SUV reappeared behind us, its headlights like twin pinpricks in the darkness. It followed closely, then swerved into the other lane, pulling up alongside my cab. Through the window, I caught a glimpse of the driver, a man with hollow eyes and a cold, dead expression. The SUV swerved suddenly, ramming the side of my trailer. The truck shuddered, and I struggled to keep it on the road. Anna sat motionless, watching the scene unfold as if it were a movie. "Hold on!" I shouted, gripping the wheel with both hands. The SUV rammed us again, harder this time. My tires screeched as I fought to maintain control. Desperate, I slammed on the brakes, hoping to force the SUV to overshoot us. The rig groaned in protest, the damaged brakes barely responding. It worked, sort of. The SUV sped ahead, but it quickly turned around, blocking the road. I had no choice but to stop. The two men climbed out, one holding a crowbar, the other a pistol. They approached the cab with slow, deliberate steps. "What do they want?" I whispered. Anna turned to me, her eyes suddenly glowing faintly in the dim light. "They want what they've always wanted. To take what isn't theirs." I didn't have time to process her words. The man with the pistol raised it, aiming directly at me. Before he could pull the trigger, Anna opened the door and stepped out. "What are you doing?" I shouted, but she ignored me. The men froze as she approached. Their tough exteriors faltered, replaced by confusion and fear. Anna spoke to them in a language I didn't understand, her voice echoing unnaturally. The man with the crowbar dropped it and took off running into the desert. The other hesitated, then fired his gun. The bullet passed through Anna as if she weren't there. She smiled at him, a cold, knowing smile, and took another step forward. The man screamed, stumbling backward. He tripped, hitting his head on the asphalt with a sickening thud. His body went limp. Anna turned back to me, her face now calm and human again. "It's over." "What the hell are you?" I whispered. She climbed back into the cab. "Just someone who doesn't want to see you make the same mistakes they did." I didn't ask anything else. I didn't want to know. I drove the rest of the way to Salt Lake in silence, the SUV and its occupants left behind on the lonely stretch of highway. When I finally reached the drop-off point, Anna was gone. No sign she'd ever been there. But as I climbed out of the cab, I noticed something strange. Scratched into the dirt on the trailer door were 3 words. "Keep moving forward." I don't know who or what Anna was, but I'll never forget her, or the lesson she taught me on that cold, dark highway.